Welcome back to Island Bike Life. Today, we're taking a look at the all-new and freshly revamped 2020 Santa Cruz Hightower. I got this bike from Grant and the fellas down at COWICHAN Cycles, located in Duncan, here on Vancouver Island. They're one of the Pacific Northwest premium Santa Cruz dealers, and if you want to take this particular bike out or one of their other many demos, go see them, they'll sort you out. In order to really get a feel for what this all-new Hightower is about, I had the opportunity to bring it back to my home trails. I took it in and around the South Benson Riding Network area, as well as the Ridge Runner Network directly adjacent to it. These two areas are easily some of my most favorite on all of Vancouver Island. They offer everything from pretty light cross country to some really great downhill lines. Speaking of the bike, this particular model was a carbon build with the S kit on it. It was a large size frame, and though I am 6'1" with a 33-inch inseam, there's no doubt that I would absolutely be on the XL. Some of the riding characteristics that I experienced with this particular bike, I don't attribute to the overall bike setup, more of the fact that the bike was one size down from what I would be most comfortable with, and had I been on the proper sizing, I think some of those minor idiosyncrasies would not have been quite so obvious. Speaking of the geo, this particular bike is really well appointed and does come with some of the most modern geometry numbers that are becoming pretty standard across all bike categories. I ran this bike in the low setting. It has both a low and a high, and unless you're experiencing excessive pedal strikes, I don't see any reason why you would ever want to move it out of the low setting. The reach on this particular bike in the high was 470 millimeters with an overall stack of 621. The head tube was 65.2 degrees with a relatively steep and aggressive seat tube of 76.5, which really helped in the pedaling category later on. The bike itself is really quite long for a large at 1232 for the wheelbase. It has fairly reasonable but overly standard chainstays with 434 millimeters in length, but a pretty low bottom bracket height of 340 millimeters. All of this together resulted in a really well balanced and overall great feeling bike, and the geometry really was spot on. The build kit, like I said, was the carbon frame S kit and was pretty well set up. The suspension setup on this bike really was quite excellent. It has the all-new Lyric Select Plus up front at 150 millimeters, supported by the Super Deluxe Plus in the rear, with a total travel category of 140 millimeters out back. This is complemented by a full GX drivetrain with the exception of steel cranks, and of course has a 73 millimeter threaded bottom bracket. It's supported in the cockpit by a race face bar and stem combo with Code R brakes for stopping with 180 millimeter rotors front and rear. The wheels are a nice setup of DT370 hubs laced to race face Arc 30 rims that are wrapped in Maxxis rubber, a DHF, and DHR2 in the rear. It also has the newly revised RockShox Reverb dropper post, and the only two pieces of kit that I personally didn't like was the stock saddle and the grips. These two particular touch points just were pretty uncomfortable for me, and the grips I found were almost like riding on cement blocks. And so for the price you pay, I don't know why they wouldn't put on a nicer set like some Ergons or some ODIs, for example. The climbing category in this particular bike is where I was most surprised. I've had issues over all of the most recent lower link VPP bikes, starting with the Nomad and then the Bronson, and most recently the Mega Tower, with getting the rear shock to feel the way I'd like it to feel. It always took some tinkering, and it was a little finicky to get dialed in with the correct pressure.
Whatever Santa Cruz did with the shock tune or the linkage on the new Hightower is really very refreshing.
I'm not sure exactly what Santa Cruz has done with this particular bike. I don't know if they changed the linkage overall or if they redid the custom tune in the shock, but this had hands down the easiest and best feeling lower link VPP pedaling platform that I've been on to date.
Great traction, even on super loose and quite steep trail. Hightower performs really well.
I was able to set it up really easily. I set it up a little bit stiffer than what Santa Cruz recommended on their website and got in right around that 32-ish% sag and never looked back. As for fire road and single track climbing, both were excellent. It was so nice and supportive with very little or no pedal bob. I actually stopped on 2 different occasions to see if I had accidentally switched the shock into a lockout mode, which I hadn't done. It really was just that firm. It tracked really nice on single track up and over rocks and roots, was a really supportive feeling, and only when I stood up and really put power down did I notice any real pedal bob, but it wasn't so bad that it zapped my power or caused me to spin out. I had traction on even the most steepest hills, both single track and fire road, and that was a nice surprise.
You know, single track climbing is much of the same. Easily the nicest lower link climbing bike I've been on to date, without question. Good traction on the single track when climbing, while still maintaining that nice supportive pedal platform. Something you're going to want out of a trail bike like this.
The climbing category clearly for me is the area that I was most not looking forward to on this bike, but in the end was the area that I was most surprised and really happy with, and really pushed this bike way up high on my list of just excellent aggressive trail bikes. As for trail riding, well, this bike should be good. It's a trail bike. No, it's not an XC bike, so it's not going to be the absolute most efficient pinnacle of cross-country racing, and it's not a crazy downhill bike, so I wouldn't expect it to be a little bit of a slog. It hit that middle mark right away, and it definitely didn't let me down. In this particular category, much like when I was climbing and descending, it really tracked the ground well. I've had previous issues with this lower link VPP not feeling quite right in certain situations because it was so finicky. But because this bike was able to set up so nicely, and the tune on the shock in the back and just the overall setup of the suspension feel really allowed for an incredibly fun trail riding bike. And that's what this thing is for.
Woo! You! Wow, what a fun bike. So light. New Hightower just eats up steep slabs like that. Zero issues.
I could easily see myself taking this thing out on crazy long trail days, big long multi-session rides, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and not feel like I'm outgunned or have too much bike to do that. This bike with 150 mils up front and 140 out back is pretty damn good for anywhere here in the Pacific Northwest, at least anywhere that I've ridden. It feels very light, and so on the trail it moves around really nicely. It does come up and over things, and the RockShox suspension does a great job of making the bike feel very nimble. This particular bike is heavier than the previous generation Hightower and also the Hightower LT by a fair margin, but I never noticed it on the trail, and it's something that I was really thinking about. The bike itself looks burlier, but it feels lighter. I'm not sure exactly how Santa Cruz did that, but in the trail riding category, it really did make a difference, and I had an absolute wonderful time. The descending on this bike was also a nice surprise. I expected it to be fun and quite enjoyable, as my previous Hightower was many years ago, but it took that and doubled it at least. Because of the nice steep head tube angle at 65.2 degrees, like I said, in the low setting, a really generous wheelbase, and the overall traction that the suspension pairing had, this bike was really quite stable and felt very capable going downhill. The drops and jumps that I did hit, while they weren't clearly the biggest ones that we have out here, never left me feeling out there. It definitely gave me the confidence to try to send jumps a little bit farther or hit drops a little bit bigger. I'd love to have a little bit more time on this bike to really take it down some trails that I'm feeling very comfortable on with jumps and drops, to really push this thing at least to the limit that I can. I feel like this bike, when it comes to descending, really hits above its weight class. That is supported by the nice big Lyric up front at 150 millimeters. They could have downsized this fork in a sense and put a pike on it, a little bit of a more trail-focused fork, but I don't think that's what they're trying to do here. They're going to have a revamped Tallboy pretty soon. They have their Mega Tower, which is an enduro race bike, and they have this one that's right in the middle. You don't have to be an XC racer or an enduro racer, but you can get this bike and do a mixture of all of them, and the descending won't let you down. When it came to the comparative category, there's absolutely no doubt you're on a Santa Cruz and you're on a little bit of a boutique brand. Don't let that mistake you. You're going to pay a little bit more for that. You're in the range of similar boutique bikes like Evil, Yeti, Ibis, and Pivot, for example. You're going to pay a little bit more. The build kit on each level is not too bad. It's pretty reasonable, and I think the value is there. It's only until you get to the highest level models, the XTR and XX1 reserve bikes, where your prices are really going to start to be astronomical. You're not going to be in the Rocky Mountain and Norco range, but you know that going in. Part of what you're paying for is the attention to detail that Santa Cruz has, which is really second to none in the bike industry from what I've seen. A really great suspension platform in this particular bike, some great features like a threaded bottom bracket, lifetime warranty on the frame, and a lifetime warranty on the bearings. All of those things add value to the price that you pay, and their customer service and warranty, should you need it, really are top shelf. So really, what are my final thoughts on the all-new 2020 Santa Cruz Hightower? Well, one of my favorite bikes of all time was my previous Hightower. It was Sriracha Red, it was beautiful, and I loved it. It had some quirks that I didn't love. It had a little bit of a notchy feeling in the mid-stroke. It wasn't quite aggressive enough for what I wanted, but it wasn't quite trail enough for BC Bike Race that I did the year that I owned that bike. So even though I loved it, I ended up selling it. This particular bike, however, fixes all of the things that I didn't necessarily like about the aggressiveness of my old Hightower, and adds even a few extra bonuses to the cross-country or pedaling area that the other one I felt lacked a little bit. This thing really is incredibly well-rounded. Easily and without question, at least to me in my mind, the best Santa Cruz bike that I've ever been on, and I would absolutely recommend it as a Pacific Northwest, one bike only, do whatever you want, quiver killer type of bike. It's better than the previous Hightower in every way that I've experienced, and really is just about perfect for what I would consider to be a well-rounded, aggressive trail bike here for Vancouver Island.
What a perfectly balanced bike. Hands down, my favorite Santa Cruz of all time, right here. Hightower version 2.
I really hope you like this look at the all-new and revamped 2020 Santa Cruz Hightower. If you want to take this guy out for a spin or one of the other demos, like I said, go see Grant and the guys down at COWICHAN Cycles, located in Duncan here on Vancouver Island. If you like what I'm doing here, think about hitting the subscribe and the like button. Leave me a comment down below and come and find me on Instagram. And as always, thanks again for watching. Now let's go hit the trails.